This happened in 2015, when I was 16 and still living in my hometown. It's a forgotten little beach town in the middle of nowhere that's so remote that it's probably not even known by the surrounding areas. Basically, there are only 3 things that you can do there as a teenager. You can go to the movies, swim, or go to this pathetic little place called Miller's Fun Park. It's relatively similar to a lot of local theme parks, only a whole lot worse. There's a crappy little arcade with broken skee-ball machines, batting cages that probably haven't been used since the early 80s, a mini golf course, and the most dangerous go-karts you've probably ever seen in your life. Seriously. Miller's Fun Park is located at the very end of a field. On the opposite side of the field, about 3 miles down, is the beach, and across a single street are woods. If our town was in the middle of nowhere, Miller's is practically on the moon. Anyway, my cousin Emma and I decided one summer night that we wanted to go go-karting. It was around 10 p.m. We knew that it would be almost deserted, but that's the way we liked it. I picked her up from her house, and we made the long drive down. Once we arrived and parked in the nearly empty parking lot, we hopped out of the car and paid for some go-karting tickets. There was no one there except for a few kids in the arcade, and a man who looked to be in his 60s sitting on the bench near the batting cages. Emma and I paid him no mind and made our way to the go-kart track. Like I said, these karts were incredibly dangerous, so I was focused on nothing but making sure I wasn't going to skid and flip. This is why I didn't notice the man walking over to the fence and watching us until we pulled into the lanes after our last lap. He was standing on the other side of the fence, right where I parked. He gawked at me with the most unsettling expression. A creepy smile dawned on his cracked lips as his dark eyes gleamed. I managed an uneasy smile and handed another ticket to the guy running the go-karts, who was obviously higher than a kite and was completely oblivious to what was going on. Emma and I went off again, but this time I couldn't focus. The guy by the fence gave me the worst type of feeling. My eyes were constantly finding their way to where he stood, unmoving, and watching us every time we came within his line of sight. The thing that was bothering me the most was that we only had 3 tickets, and we were on our second to last run, and he was standing directly next to the exit gate. I was just praying that he would move on before we were done. But of course, no such luck. Our last go came and went, and I had no choice but to pull next to him, unbuckle my seatbelt, and exit my go-kart. I looked over at Emma just a few feet away to see if she was as scared as I was. She didn't seem to notice as she bounced over and bragged about how she beat me the last 2 times. I barely paid attention. As soon as we passed through the gate, the guy stepped in front of us. "Hey there," he said. His voice was dry, and he smelled like cigarettes. "What are you girls doing here all alone?" My eyes darted over to Emma, who was looking at the man in both confusion and annoyance. What? It's so late. Do your parents know that you're out?" The way he spoke reminded me of a snake. I quickly responded, "Yes. They're waiting for us, actually. We need to get going." This was a lie, and probably sounded like it from my tone, but I tried to push past him, and it didn't work. He grabbed my shoulder to keep me in front of him. "Nonsense. I saw you guys pull up, and there was no one else with you." My heart dropped to my stomach. "Are you heading out? Why don't I walk you to your car?" I looked over to Emma for help. With one swift movement, she pulled me halfway behind her and started sizing the guy up. This was pretty dumb because we were both small, and though she's a few inches taller than me, neither of us came anywhere close to his size. This man had to be at least 6'2", but Emma didn't seem to care. Actually, we were just heading to the arcade. Her boyfriend is going to meet us there. I did have a boyfriend at the time, but he wasn't meeting us there. He wasn't even in town. The man's face immediately changed. His smile disappeared, and he was now glaring at me with a look of annoyance in his eyes, and I felt myself start to cower. Boyfriend? Emma didn't give me time to say anything. She grabbed my arm, and we quickly went past the man into the arcade. The kids from before had already left, and not a single employee was in sight. Still, it felt safer in there than it did outside. We ran to the back and hid behind the claw machine. What the hell do we do? I left my phone in the car. There was no way that we were going out there alone, and the pothead go-kart guy had already disappeared into the small ticket shack. I don't have mine either. I left it charging. We're just going to have to make a break for it. Are you crazy? He's probably waiting for us in the parking lot. What about the guy who runs the go-karts? Maybe we could get him to walk out with us. I just shook my head. He is higher than Mount Everest right now. I don't want to risk running all the way to the ticket stand for nothing. Then we really don't have a choice. Let's go. I gulped. I had never been so scared before in my life. Emma practically dragged me out of the exit, looking around to see if the man was nearby, waiting for the guy to come out of the woods or something. Hurry up and get your keys out, Emma instructed, and I pulled the keys from my pocket. We were about 20 feet from my car when I stopped dead in my tracks. I stared at my car, keys in hand, and I realized something horrifying in that moment. I had forgotten to lock it. Emma, I never locked the car. What? I didn't lock it. What if... I trailed off, but she knew what I was going to say. She began inching towards the car, and I grabbed her arm to stop her, but she pulled away. I'm just going to peek. If I say run, you run. I nodded in agreement. She eventually made it close enough to see inside, but by the way she was squinting, I knew that it was too dark to make anything out. My heart was beating out of my chest. What if he's in there? What if he jumps out? Or what if we get in and he strangles me to death like in the movies? All these thoughts almost drowned out the unmistakable sound of shoes slamming against pavement. My head whipped around instantly, and there he was, sprinting at his full speed, coming directly from the woods. I screamed bloody murder and made a break for the car, jiggling the handle as I realized that I had locked it. Emma was already on the other side, screaming at me to unlock the car. I fumbled with the keys, but managed not to drop them as I unlocked the door, flung it open, and practically threw myself inside. I had just managed to close the door when I looked up and saw him standing there, slamming his fists against the window and shouting incoherently. I was sobbing at this point and barely managed to lock the doors as he went for the handle and yanked it as hard as he could. Emma was screaming at me to go, and through my tears I shoved the key into the ignition and flew into reverse. He was still chasing and yelling at us as I reversed out of the parking lot and turned as fast as I could. I was driving like I was still on the go-kart track, but I didn't care. I was so upset that I could barely see the road through the flood of tears, and Emma had to grab the steering wheel several times to keep us from crashing before I could regain some composure. Though obviously shaken up, she managed to hold her tears back and be the rational one out of the two of us, as we drove at least 30 miles over the speed limit the whole way back to my house. We didn't tell either of my parents about what happened, and looking back I wish we had, because there was something seriously wrong with that man. At the time, we thought that they would blame us somehow, so it stayed a secret between Emma and I, something that we didn't even talk about until months after the horrifying encounter. It's safe to assume that we never went back to Miller's Fun Park after that. This happened when I was 5 years old, and it's one of the only vivid memories I have from that time in my life. My family is originally from Europe, but later immigrated to America. My grandmother would come visit us for about 3 months every year. During the summer in question, my grandmother was staying with us, and she planned on taking me to the local park near my house. I was waiting in the driveway, while she was inside, gathering up a few things. I then noticed a black car slowly cruising down the street before coming to a stop in front of my driveway. I didn't find it unusual at first. Perhaps they were just using the driveway to turn around. Then a black male exited the car and began walking toward me. I just kind of stood there in shock as he closed in. The man then outstretched his arms like he was going to grab me. I remember thinking that he was the boogeyman. I stood there, frozen, as he came within a few inches of reaching me. But I finally was able to snap out of my trance and back away until I got to the front door and started banging on it to alert my grandmother. I heard the man behind me saying something under his breath before he ran back to his car. My grandmother opened the door as soon as he backed out of the driveway and sped off down the road. I told her what just happened, but she was a stubborn woman and didn't believe me. Looking back, I don't blame her. I was known for having quite the imagination, but this was not one of those instances where I was making something up for attention. Now that I'm older, the situation frightens me even more. Some random stranger pulled into our driveway and tried to snatch up a child in broad daylight. Long-time listener, first-time submitter. I thought I would pick a story from my past. For some reason, it has made a resurgence and has almost become an unwelcomed guest in my mind. Perhaps sharing it will help me get over it once and for all. The year was 1986. I was 16 at the time. I was in Indianapolis at Union Station. It was around Christmas time or just after. I was with my mom, my 2-year-old sister, and my 21-year-old uncle. At this time, my uncle still lived in Indianapolis, while the rest of us lived in southwest Indiana. We were getting ready to leave and drive back home. It was very cold out that day, and I was bundled up in my jacket, scarf, and gloves. My mom, God rest her soul, could talk a dead man back to life. So I was just waiting for her long-winded wrap-up. It was getting hot standing inside Union Station while wearing all that clothing. So I told her, "It's getting too hot in here. I'm going to step out for a minute." My mom nodded, and I went out. There was no snow or wind, just perfect for me to cool down for a bit. Not even a minute or so of standing outside, right by the double doors, a white Chevrolet pulls up. 2 big men with crew cuts were sitting in the driver and passenger seats. They were at least 6'5", and probably about 280 pounds each. I figured they were probably from our local military base, but that was just an assumption. Immediately after seeing me, they stop at the curb, roll down the window, and smile. "Hey, come here. I want to talk to you," the passenger said. Bear in mind that I'm 16. If this were to happen to me today, things would be much different. But as a kid, I was very polite, almost to the point of being docile. I was always very apologetic when I thought I'd screwed up in some way. I looked up and I saw a streetlight above me. I looked back at them and started apologetically stating, "Oh, I'm sorry. This is not what it looks like." At that moment, it was more amusing to me. I hadn't really considered that I was in some kind of danger. They kept reiterating that they just wanted to talk to me, and I kept explaining to them that I'm not a street girl, and this is not what it looked like, and that I was sorry for giving the wrong impression. It didn't occur to me that they weren't listening to a word that I was saying. All of a sudden, the passenger gets out and starts moving toward me like a hungry dog staring at a T-bone steak. A switch went off in my head, and I was no longer apologetic or embarrassed. I was just pissed, and I yelled, "You don't have to get out of your car if you just want to talk to me. I can hear you just fine from here." I suddenly found the 70% Irish and Scandinavian heritage on my dad's side, and it came out in full force. I was proud of myself for having shown some backbone, but there was still a towering, hulking man coming right towards me. I bolted back inside, where my mom was still yammering. Upon seeing me, my mom and uncle were immediately alarmed. They hadn't seen the man get out of his car, but they could tell that I was frightened. I told them what happened, and my uncle asked, "What were they driving?" "A white Chevrolet." My mom then cut in, "Go get him!" My uncle bolted out of the door and down the street, chasing after the Chevrolet. "You sons of bitches, get the hell out of the car so I can bust out your teeth." My mom was livid, but I could tell that my baby sister was getting upset, so I tried talking her down. My uncle came back in a few minutes later, winded and worn out. When he caught his breath, he said, "I almost caught up with them when they got to that traffic light at the end of the block, but they peeled out right before I got there." Welp, that put a major damper on our trip to Indianapolis. The moral of the story is, ladies and gents, don't allow your good manners to supersede your own safety. Fuck that noise. Who wants to die being polite? I was born in a decently sized city with a population of about 100,000. I play hockey, and I go to school in the city. My family lives about 35 minutes south on a farm, so every day I had to drive into the city for school and hockey practice. My team had an upcoming home game, so I was on my way into the city one day. There's roughly a 2-kilometer gravel road that you have to go down before you get to the main highway that leads directly into the city. Before turning onto the highway, there was a ditch where a derelict tractor sat. It had been there for about a month. As I passed by the tractor that day, I noticed something odd. There was someone under the tractor. Their head was hidden by the tractor wheel. It almost looked like they were trying to repair the tractor. But they weren't moving at all. It was odd. I didn't want to be late for the game, so I just kept driving. After my game, I met up with my mom before heading home. She liked to attend my games whenever she could. She then gets a call from my aunt. "You are not going to believe this, but there was a guy who had his head chopped off while he was repairing a tractor. They found him right around where you guys live." My heart dropped. I remember driving past that tractor merely 5 hours prior. He could have been laying there with no head. On my way back home, there was an ambulance, police cars, and men taking photographs. They hadn't removed the body yet. However, they did place a blanket over it. I don't know if I should put it this way, but it's a good thing that the big wheel blocked the view from the gravel road. It would have been difficult for me to see a headless corpse, but my mom had my younger brother with her in the car. If he would have seen something like that, it would have messed him up for life. This experience happened in 2019. At the time, I was 22, attending Brigham Young University in Utah. It was getting close to Thanksgiving break, and I was planning on traveling home to California the weekend before. My parents live in the Bay Area, and it was about a 12-hour drive to get home. Leading up to that Saturday, I was constantly checking the weather, because the Sierra Nevadas near Tahoe can be very dangerous to drive through when it's snowing. In years past, I could get through the Sierra Nevadas with relative ease, but of course, that year, the weather report stated that a huge snowstorm would be coming through, the day that I was supposed to be traveling. My sister, who would also travel home with me, decided to book a last-minute flight because she didn't want to risk driving through the snowstorm. However, being confident in my driving capabilities and not wanting to spend a few $100 on a last-minute flight, I decided that I would take my chances on the highway. Knowing that I probably wouldn't be able to make the drive in my 2014 Ford Focus, which was only a front-wheel drive, I asked my sister if I could take her Jeep Wrangler instead. She agreed, on the condition that I had to take her to the Salt Lake City airport the night of her flight. So the day came, and I began my 12-hour drive home, going north on I-15, and eventually got on I-80 west once I hit Salt Lake City. Driving on I-80 through Nevada was clear, as the snowstorm was coming from the west. I constantly looked to see if the weather would change, but each time I checked, the weather report remained unchanged. 7 to 8 hours into my drive, I saw one of those electric highway signs that stated that I-80 would be closed due to the severe weather conditions. I started to worry because it was around 5 p.m., and there was no way that I was turning around and going back. I stopped my car once I hit Reno for some gas and to think things over. I had two reasonable options that I could take: either spend the night in Reno or find another way through the storm. Being that I didn't want to spend the extra money to find a hotel, I made the choice to find an alternate route. I looked at my GPS, and I discovered that there was another pass through the Sierra Nevadas if I went south through Carson City. By this time, the storm had started to pick up, and I would have to drive cautiously. I was able to make it to the entrance of the Sierra Nevada Pass. There was a couple of road workers stopping cars to make sure that they either had chains or all-wheel drive. The Jeep was equipped with both. I had to drive slowly, between 10 to 20 miles per hour, because the roads were completely covered with compacted snow, with wind gusts set over 30 miles per hour. I had the defrost on at full blast, with the windshield wipers going maximum speed in order to see properly. After about an hour of going at a grueling pace, I became frustrated because I was making very little progress. I was in the middle of the Sierra Nevada mountain range, with forests on both sides of the road. The ground was completely blanketed by snow and ice. As the darkness crept in, I could barely see any other cars on the road. I had the Jeep in first gear, allowing me to engine brake, but I foolishly decided to increase my speed to about 25 to 30 miles per hour to escape the blizzard faster. The Jeep slipped right off the road and into a small ditch. Luckily, I wasn't hurt, because I hadn't really been going that fast. However, the Jeep was now trapped in deep snow, and when I pushed the gas pedal to get out, it wouldn't budge. After a few minutes of hopelessly trying to get out of the ditch, I realized that I would have to get out of the car and see if I could find some way to get traction. The temperatures had reached freezing outside, but thankfully, I had a winter coat that I could put on. I walked around the Jeep to see the entire situation that I was in. My best course of action was to dig the snow out from around my tires. I couldn't put the chains on the Jeep now, and I was stupid for not doing so earlier. I also didn't have gloves or a shovel, so I would have to dig with my bare hands. After a few minutes, my fingers were freezing. I got back inside the Jeep, and I tried to move it. It was only able to move slightly. I was still stuck. This is when panic began to set in. I hadn't seen another car in over 45 minutes, and it had no cell service, which was no surprise, being in the middle of the Sierra Nevada mountain range. I felt completely hopeless as I looked out my window and saw the maze of trees swaying in the blistering wind. I thought I could find some fallen branches or something that I could give my wheels traction with. I didn't want to go too far in case another car would see me and stop for help. I walked about 50 yards into the woods. I only had my phone flashlight on me, which didn't provide much light. I searched for any type of loose wood. Most of the branches were higher than I could reach. Luckily, I found a few fallen branches that weren't as thick. I snapped them in half so I would have more pieces to stick under my wheels. I then heard what sounded like footsteps. I stopped and listened. All I heard was the sound of the howling wind. I suddenly felt very uneasy. I was basically in the middle of nowhere, and I felt like someone was watching me. I had no idea why somebody else would be out in the middle of a blizzard at this time. I then saw a low-hanging branch on a tree that was thin enough for me to break off, so I quickly did so. As soon as I did, I heard the footsteps again. There was no doubt in my mind that someone else was lurking nearby. I squinted my eyes, looking around in the dark, pointing my phone flashlight in every direction. To my horror, I then saw the outline of a dark, hooded figure standing about 25 yards away. I looked at it for several seconds as they stared back at me. I was paralyzed by fear. My fight or flight kicked in. I turned around and started sprinting through the snow, back toward the Jeep. I could hear the footsteps trailing behind me. Whoever I saw was now chasing me. My mind felt like it was moving at 1,000,000 miles per second, and I knew what I had to do. When I reached the Jeep, I quickly shoved all the sticks behind both of the rear tires, knowing that I wouldn't have time to do the same to the front. Thankfully, the Jeep was still running. I dared not look behind me as I jumped inside and quickly locked the door. As soon as I did, the figure caught up to me and banged on the driver's side window.
Open up the door, now.
It looked like he was holding some kind of blade in his hand. I looked into his face as I put the Jeep into reverse. The man's eyes were the eyes of a psychopath. I pressed down on the gas as the man continued screaming,
Open the fucking door.
I can only thank God that the Jeep was able to gain traction and back out of the ditch. The sticks must have given the wheels enough traction to get me back out onto the road. The man then threw the knife directly at my head. If it wasn't for the windshield, it would have impaled me right between the eyes. I could hear the man's crazed wailing as I took off down the road. I had to be extremely careful not to accelerate too fast, as I didn't want to end up in another ditch. I looked into my rearview mirror to see the man standing in the road, watching me drive away. I was on edge the rest of the way home. It took me 3 hours longer than it usually would have, but I eventually made it home after midnight, exhausted from driving and having been chased by a homicidal lunatic. Looking back, if I hadn't taken my sister's Jeep, I don't think I would have made it out. I also didn't bother calling the police once I got service again. I just didn't want to deal with filing a police report. I was tired and just wanted to get home. But I sincerely hope nobody else driving that night encountered that deranged man in the forest. This happened 2 years ago, when I was a senior in high school. It was a Saturday night, and my friends and I were hanging out at my place, like we usually did. Around 11:30, my two friends, who I will call Mike and Steve, said that they were ready to go back home. Neither of them had a car at the time, so I had to drive them home, which I had done several times before. I always dropped off Mike first because he lived further away. However, getting to Mike's house from mine was pretty simple, as it was pretty much just a straight shot. Then I'd drop off Steve on my way back. That night, we were about halfway to Mike's when we hit a red light at an intersection. We were in the middle lane, and this silver sedan was pulled up next to us in the right lane, which allowed you to either go straight or turn right. When the light turned green, We both went. The sedan suddenly cut us off, causing me to slam on the brake. The driver kept going as I laid on the horn. The fuck is this guy's problem? We were driving behind the sedan for a little while, and eventually ended up at another red light. There were 2 lanes at this intersection, so I pulled up into the left lane, so our vehicles were parallel. The driver in the sedan looked to be about our age. He rolled down his window and began flipping us off. At this point, I became furious and rolled down my window. Why don't you learn how to drive, you jackass? I started giving him the finger as well, and so did Mike, who was sitting up front. Steve was a pretty chill guy and just sat back and enjoyed the show, as Mike and I were getting into it with the guy. He started asking us if we wanted to fight, which I thought was hilarious, since there were 3 of us and 1 of him. The light finally changed, and this time, we were in front of him. That's when the intensity of this situation changed completely. The sedan got so close that his bumper was practically touching mine. He also flipped on his high beams and began swerving his car like some kind of lunatic. I was horrified that he would ram into the back of my car, causing us to crash. I started to speed up, hoping to gain some distance, but he tailed me no matter how fast I went. Meanwhile, Mike and Steve were understandably freaking out. This went on for about 2 or 3 minutes. He stayed on our tail and kept swerving. When the shoulder got wider, he quickly sped up, went around us, then veered into our lane, cutting us off a second time. This guy was insane. I slammed on the brakes going about 50 miles per hour. I still don't know how I managed to miss him. As I pulled over, he sped off down the road and actually cut somebody else off at the next intersection. But after that, he disappeared. And the 3 of us were pretty shaken up. That was the first time in my life that I had ever encountered anyone who was that unhinged. It was probably a good thing that we didn't end up fighting, because he would probably be one of those guys who bites your nose off. Nothing else happened the rest of the way to Mike's. The whole time, I looked behind us, just to make sure that we weren't being followed. Thankfully, we never saw that guy again. This experience is somewhat amusing to look back on now, but when it was happening, it was terrifying. At any moment, he could have rammed into us, causing me to lose control of the car and crash. The way that he swerved into our lane indicated that he clearly had no regard for our safety, or even his own. I've never antagonized another driver like that since, and I'd advise you all to avoid doing that as well. You never really know if the person behind the wheel is a lunatic. This event took place during the summer of 2021. I was 16 at the time. Myself and a couple of friends, Adam, Ross, and my girlfriend Nevie, were planning to meet up for a birthday party. Our childhood friend, Faith, was turning 16. She wanted to celebrate by getting drunk in the forest outside of our local park. Faith was one of those mischievous types, always finding any possible way to get everyone into some sort of trouble, always had to be the center of attention, and didn't do too well with accountability. So later that day, we all met up outside of a local shopping center, where we waited for a taxi to take us to the party. Our parents weren't really clued in on what was happening. A little while later, the cab arrived, and we piled in. An uneasy feeling swept over me as soon as my eyes and the driver's eyes met. Something inside me told me that I should just go home. The driver was an old, scruffy-looking man, maybe in his late 50s. And the smell. My God, it was like his last passengers were roadkill. I awkwardly looked at my friends, all talking amongst each other, completely oblivious. I tried my best not to look uncomfortable, I'll never see this man again after this cab ride, so I decided to just deal with it. After what felt like hours, the driver pulled into the parking lot, and we all got out of the taxi. One of my other friends paid the driver and quickly shut the door, but before we could start walking away, the driver rolled down his window and asked, "What are you kids doing out here? I think you're a bit too old to be playing on playgrounds, don't you think?" Nevy and I looked at each other before responding. "It's our friend's birthday today, so we're just out here celebrating." "In the woods?" I saw Faith looking at me and smirking. I knew that she was going to say something stupid, but before she could get a word out, my friend Adam quickly cut in. "We aren't really the kind of people who like to party in clubs or bars. Hanging out in the woods is good enough for us." The cab driver grinned from ear to ear, revealing his gingivitis-infested mouth before saying, "Oh, okay then. I guess I'll see you later." What?" The man just smiled at us, then quickly rolled up his window and sped off. "What a freak," Faith chimed in, as she picked up her bag full of alcohol and started walking toward the trail. We then followed her into the woods. Once we got to the river, we all pretty much forgot about the creepy cab driver, and we all began drinking without hesitation. Faith pulled out a radio from her bag and began blasting some awful rave music. I'm more of a punk rock kind of guy, but hey, it was her birthday, so I just went with it. Maybe about an hour or so later, we were all pretty much wasted. Myself, Faith, and Ross began smoking some weed. I then stumbled back over to Nevy and sat down beside her, putting my arm around her while the others were still jumping around like a bunch of lunatics. I felt myself becoming very drowsy, and a few minutes later, I passed out. When I woke up, it was still dark outside, and I was still slouched beside Nevy. The rest of the group had seemed to calm down a bit as well. I guess all the alcohol and weed were finally catching up with everybody. I had to take a massive piss, so I began making my way toward a nearby bush and did my business. As I was zipping back up, I heard a sound in the distance, coming from the trail. I stood there for a minute and listened. It sounded like a man screaming at the top of his lungs. I quickly ran back to the others and turned off the radio. "What the fuck?" shouted Faith. I motioned for her to be quiet, but of course, she was not going to listen. She switched the music back on and turned the volume up even louder and began singing in a drunken voice. It was really annoying. Nevy stood up and came over to me. "What happened?" "I heard someone coming down the trail. I think they were screaming." When I said this, Ross picked up the radio and chucked it into the river. "What the fuck, Ross?" "Shut your drunk ass up, Faith. We have company." Ross pointed to the trail, and we all looked over. My heart sank as soon as I saw a figure standing there, blocking the path. The man came out from the trees. We saw that he was holding a knife in his hand and was almost completely covered in a dark liquid. In his other hand, he was holding a carcass. Holy shit. I grabbed Nevy's hand as she stood behind me. "What do you want, man?" The man began mumbling to himself and laughing, shaking the dead animal as if it was some kind of trophy. The poor thing was a dead rabbit. The man then threw the rabbit onto the ground, right in front of us. Faith then stood up. "Get the fuck out of here, you freak!" She then picked up an empty bottle and threw it at the man, almost hitting him. The man stopped laughing and then glared at us.
"You are really going to regret that."
He then began charging towards us. "Run!" We all sprinted deeper into the woods. I was still holding Nevy's hand, basically forcing her to get in front of me. Ross was trailing behind us a bit. As we ran, I could hear the man chasing after us, still screaming like a maniac. I felt like my heart was going to explode out of my chest. After what felt like forever, I finally saw a road approximately 60 feet away. I glanced behind me to see if the man was still there. And of course, he was, and he was gaining on us. Suddenly, I saw a pair of headlights approaching in the distance. I began waving my arms frantically, desperately trying to get the driver's attention. The deranged man clearly noticed the headlights as well, because he stopped chasing us and watched as we all made it out to the road. All of us were waving our arms, trying to get the driver to stop. The headlights were coming from a minibus, which thankfully came to a stop. A middle-aged man quickly rushed out of the vehicle. "What's going on here? Are you kids okay?" "No, there's a psycho in the woods trying to kill us." "Well, come on then. I'll get you guys out of here." I cannot explain to you how lucky we were that a man driving an empty minibus happened to be traveling down that road. As he began to pull away, I look back, and I shit you not. Standing in the road, I saw the man who had chased us out of the woods. But then, someone else emerged from the trees and stood next to him. I told the others what I saw as the bus pulled away. I then looked at Faith. She could tell that I was clearly pissed off at her. "What the fuck were you thinking? I'm sorry, okay? You could have gotten us all killed." I sat back down next to Nevy, trying my best to calm down. I know that most of you are probably wondering why we didn't call the police. In all honesty, none of us wanted to own up to drinking. We thanked the guy for saving our asses, but he wanted to know more about what exactly happened back there. We just kind of stonewalled him, for the reason that I just mentioned. When he dropped us off at the shopping center, he said that he would call the police and report the incident. We all exited the bus and just sort of ran away. After that night, none of us wanted to hang out with Faith anymore. This wasn't the first time that her reckless behavior got us into trouble. Sure, a knife-wielding maniac in the woods is cause for concern, but you don't have to throw a fucking bottle at him. Perhaps there would have been a chance he would have left us alone if she hadn't done that. But then again, maybe that wasn't the case, because I still wonder about that second person that appeared on the road that night. Something deep down tells me it was the cab driver. I just can't overlook that strange remark he made after he dropped us off. I guess I'll see you later. How's it going there, eh? My name is Brett, and I'm a proud Canadian. I currently live in Vancouver, but I grew up in the Northwest Territories. To give you an idea of how secluded this entire area is, the biggest city there is Yellowknife, which has a population of about 20,000. We lived in a house on the outskirts of the city. To get to our place, there was an unmarked dirt road that you had to take off the highway for about a mile before you reached a clearing where our house was. Now, when I say that our property was surrounded by forest, I sincerely mean it. The forest that surrounded our home is said to be larger than the United Kingdom. Miles upon miles of trees and bushes. Plenty of places to hide a body. We moved out there when I was about 7 years old, back in 1994. It would be about another 2 years before my little brother Jerry was born. So I vividly remember playing outside alone with my dog Jack. Jack was a golden retriever, and he'd often accompany me whenever I decided to venture off into the forest, or when my dad and I would go fishing in the nearby river. Anyway, this happened in the summer of 1995. Jack and I were hiking on the trail behind our house. I had hiked on this trail before, but I'd never gone too far in. About 5 minutes into the walk, Jack began acting strange and started growling. "What's wrong, boy?" Jack gave me a pitiful look and then took off back toward the house. "Jack, get back here!" I called, but it was useless. Soon, he vanished from view. I thought that maybe Jack wasn't feeling well or something. Again, I was 7 years old, and I didn't take this as a warning sign. So I continued down the trail. After a few more minutes, I decided to turn around. I didn't want to go too far in without Jack, so I picked up a stick and drew a big X into the ground, thinking that when I came back, I would know how far I had gone before stopping. I turned around and saw something unusual. Standing about 20 yards from the trail, among the trees, was a girl about my age. She had long, dark hair that covered her face, and she was wearing a white and blue dress. Hello? Who are you?" The girl did not respond. She pointed to the ground beside her before skipping off into the forest. I just stood there, completely stunned. We were the only family who lived out here. In all of my time living there, I had never seen anyone roaming the forest. Not once. At the time, I wasn't scared. I was more confused. I snapped out of my trance, and I approached the spot where I had seen the girl. What was she pointing at? I knelt down and brushed away some dead leaves. I saw what looked like a shoe sticking out of the ground. With my hands, I dug it up until I could pull it out. It was an old sneaker, definitely kid-sized. Here's what was going through my 7-year-old head. Maybe the girl lost a pair of shoes while she was out here, and if I found them, I could take them back to my mom, and we can find out who that girl was and give them back to her. I thought that I might find another shoe if I dug a little deeper, so I stood over the small hole I made and began rapidly clearing away more dirt. Soon my hands felt something solid. Thinking that it had to be the second shoe, I started digging around it. Whatever it was, it definitely wasn't shaped like a shoe. I cleared one last layer of dirt, and what I saw made me stop in my tracks. I got up and slowly backed away as a pair of hollow sockets stared at me from the dirt. I had unearthed a human skull. Terrified, I ran all the way back to my house, bawling my eyes out. I immediately ran to my mother, who was in the kitchen, and I told her what I saw. I don't think she believed me at first, but said that she would tell my dad as soon as he got back from work. The next day, I showed my father where I had seen the girl. I stayed on the trail while he checked out the hole I had dug the day before. After taking a look, he walked back to the trail and said that we had to go back to the house and call the police. About 2 hours later, there were several police cars in our driveway. I would find out years later that they dug up the skeletal remains of a girl who had been missing for over 15 years. I told my parents and the police officer I spoke to about the girl that I saw in the woods that day. But everyone just dismissed my claims, and they likely thought it was just my imagination. It's normal for kids to embellish the truth sometimes, but this was not one of those times. I wouldn't have started digging at that exact spot if it wasn't for the young girl I saw pointing to it. I believe that what I saw was her spirit, and she was waiting for someone to discover her remains, so that her parents, who had waited for 15 years, would finally have some closure. I am a female, and I was 15 at the time of this experience. One night, my 2 sisters and I wanted to stay up and have some fun, so we set up camp in the living room. I got the reclining chair while my 7-year-old sister Amelia slept on an air mattress on the floor. My older sister Claire, who was 20, slept on the couch. We all chatted about drama, school, boys, and other stuff. We did stay up pretty late, but one by one, we all eventually fell asleep. I woke up some time later. I didn't know why until I heard it. There was a tapping sound coming from the window. I look over, and the curtains were drawn, but the chair that I was resting in was positioned in such a way that I could see through the gap in the curtains. I saw someone standing just outside. They then crouched down, and I caught a glimpse of an eye looking right at me. I'm still not sure if they could see me because of the poor lighting, but I was freaking out inside. The person stopped tapping and just stood there, looking through the gap in the curtains. I could not tell you what this person looked like. Most of their features were obscured by the curtains. I slowly turned over and covered myself up with a blanket, thinking that it must have been one of our sketchy neighbors or a peeping Tom, and that they would eventually go away. As I lay there facing the wall, there suddenly came a loud bang. I turned back to the window, and I saw the shadow of the person still standing by the window, but now they were slamming their fists against the window's surface. They were not trying to be stealthy whatsoever. I hate to say it, but I just kind of froze up until I heard Amelia moving around on the mattress. Shortly after, she began crying as soon as she saw the figure standing outside the window. The protective big sister inside of me snapped me out of my trance, and I tossed my blanket to the side, and I got up as quickly as I could. I knew that if the intruder broke the glass, my little sister would be in the crossfire. I picked her up and ran to the couch that Claire was sleeping on. Unfortunately, it was up against the same wall as the window, so now Amelia was crying even harder. I should mention that Claire does suffer from a sleeping disorder that she inherited from my father. Both of them have to take sleeping pills, which means once they pass out, it's next to impossible to wake them up. Given the circumstances, I tried anyway. I heard Claire mumbling something along the lines of, "Go away." I then tugged on her hair until I practically pulled her halfway off the couch. I then heard the window starting to crack. The glass was thick, but it was still possible to break it with enough force. I tried one last desperate attempt to wake Claire up. But then, the unthinkable happened. The glass shattered as the intruder hurled himself through the window, crash landing on the living room floor. Amelia and I backed away as the figure slowly stood to his feet. He then turned his head. I could not make out his face, but I could tell that there were several pieces of broken glass sticking out of his cheek and neck. He had landed right on top of the broken glass. I felt shitty for leaving Claire behind, but I had to think about my little sister. We ran to the basement, which was not the best place to hide, but I was in full panic mode at this point. We quickly went to the back of the basement and hid behind a half wall that separated the room into two sections. We heard shuffling sounds from upstairs before all went silent. After several minutes, we heard sirens in the distance. About 5 minutes later, 2 cops opened the basement door. Claire was injured from the broken glass, but otherwise, she was okay. The intruder managed to slip away before the cops arrived. I have a feeling that it was one of our neighbors, or at least they were staying at one of their houses, because a guy who had just thrown himself through a glass window would be hard to miss on a patrol. Somebody else from up the street saw someone suspicious walking down the road and decided to call the cops. They entered our house once they saw the broken glass window from the road. To this day, whoever it was has never been caught. This took place in my small hometown in Texas, which isn't too far away from Austin. when I was about 5 years old. It was the early 1980s, and crime in our town was slim to none. It wasn't uncommon for kids to wait in the car, while our parents went into the grocery store or gas station. Those were different times. My parents drove around a Buick LeSabre from the 1970s. It was cream-colored, 2-door, with a brown vinyl top. Very old school. It had electric locks and windows, and that will be important later on. One day my mother and I took a trip to the grocery store. My big brother decided to stay home and play video games. Looking back, I wish I would have stayed with him. When we got to the store, I decided to wait in the car. My mom lowered the windows a little more than halfway before she left. If you're unfamiliar with 2-door model cars from the 70s era, they had enormous windows. It wasn't summer yet, so I was comfortable with the outside temperature. I was sitting in the front passenger seat. I don't know how much time went by, but it wasn't long before a small red truck hauling a camper pulled up on my right side. Instead of getting out and going inside, the driver just sat there. He kept looking at me, then back to the parking lot, and then back to me. I wanted to roll up the windows, but I didn't have the keys. Fortunately for me, there were some people out and about, but he wasn't going to give up so easily. He opened his door and climbed out of his cab, still looking at me, then scanning the parking lot again. By this point, every alarm bell was going off in my head. I crawled into the back seat to put as much distance between him and me as possible. If he was going to try to break into the car and snatch me, I wanted to make it as difficult for him as possible, and hopefully somebody would see him and intervene. Not bad for a 5-year-old. My heart was pounding. I knew that one of two things was going to happen. I was either going to be taken, or I was going to get away. Even with the windows more than halfway down, I knew that he still didn't have enough room to pull me through. And if he managed to unlock the door and open it, I decided that I would try to escape through the opposite door. As soon as the man reached through the passenger window for the manual lock, I saw my mom emerging from the store. I opened the door and bolted toward her. As soon as I got to her, I saw the truck hauling ass out of the parking lot. If it hadn't been for my mom showing up when she did, or those cheesy educational videos about stranger danger they showed at my school, I might not have made it. I may have been just a kid back then, but I knew what that guy was up to. From that day on, I never waited in the car again. This experience made me super aware when I had my own daughter. Some people might call me overprotective, but you just can't take chances in today's world. Thank you for watching. If you have a story that you would like to share on this channel, please send it to my email, unit522stories@outlook.com. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button when notifications turned on. You can further support my channel by visiting the merch store. A link for that is in the description. You'll be hearing from me soon. Until next time, I'm your Uncle Unit. And as always, never forget. There's always a